Welcome back. I wanted to talk to you quickly about a very important topic for a developer, and that is debugging. Debugging is the act of looking over code, understanding what it's doing, and figuring out why it's not acting as expected, or maybe it's not even running. Maybe you're getting errors, or maybe something that the user does on a website is triggering a weird behavior. That's what debugging is, figuring out why the program isn't acting the way it is. And when you work as a developer, a lot of your time is spent debugging. So it's a very important topic, and I want to talk about some of the strategies that we can use for debugging. I have over here a pretty complex function. And frankly, unless you've had a lot of experience with JavaScript, this is a pretty hard function to understand. Let's say that you get into work and somebody says, hey, I don't know what's going on with this function. Can you look into it? And you have to figure out what it does and whether it's working fine or not. So I'm going to take you through the steps that I would use to debug this code. Maybe it's working fine, maybe it's not, but I want to understand what this piece of code does. So the first thing I would do is just read it. I say, okay, we're assigning a variable, and it looks like we have an array. It is a nested array, so there's an array inside of an array. And it looks like this code wants to do something called flattened. Okay, we know that reduce, from what we've learned before, A is the accumulator. I can change the name so it makes more sense to me. Okay, accumulator, perfect. And B is, well, what is B? B is this, right? Because we're iterating, looping over the first array, so it gives us 3 arrays. So I can just say array here. Okay. Now, I also see that within this reduce, I have the accumulator, I have the array, and I want the accumulator to start off with an empty array. That makes sense so far. So the accumulator is going to be an empty array when we start off. And what we're going to do is we're going to do empty array dot concat. And if you remember, concat attaches the contents of an array into whatever is being concated. One thing I can do is open up this function so that now, instead of just having one line, I can say console.log array, and we'll find out what array is. And we'll also say console.log accumulator. We'll say accumulator. All right, so we have the console opened, and we also want to make sure that we're returning this because we removed it from a single line, which already implicitly means return, to making it 2 lines. Okay, so let's just refresh and add this function and see if we can get some console logs to figure out what it's doing. There's going to be 3 loopings that we see. And in the first looping, it looks like it says the array is 0 and 1, and the accumulator is the empty array. Okay, that makes sense. And then we see the second loop around, the 2 and 3 array, which is here, gets looped around. And the accumulator now has 0 and 1. So it looks like after the first loop through, I've added the 0 and 1 of the array into the empty array, which is the accumulator. Okay, and then the last pass through, which is 4 and 5, I now attach the array of 4 and 5 into the accumulator, which has 0, 1, 2, 3. So it looks like what we're doing is we're grabbing each array and we're adding it into the accumulator. And because it looks something like this, so this is what it would look like in the first pass through, we're just using the concat function to join the arrays, 0 and 1, so that we are flattening the array. So that means instead of having an array inside of an array, we can just completely flatten everything. that means that with Flent, if I look at what it does, well, it just flans the array 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Awesome. There's one other trick I want to show you, and that is instead of using console log, you can use something called debugger. And you notice that the color turned red, which means, yep, it's a JavaScript keyword. And what this allows you to do, well, let's see what happens when I run this function. I'm going to refresh here, and I'm going to run it. Whoa, what just happened? When the JavaScript engine in the browser runs into the word debugger, it stops. It's a word that tells whatever is reading this file to, hey, stop, whatever you're doing, just freeze. And it opens up the window for us exactly where it stopped. So let me make this full screen and show you. It stops in the middle of its execution. So we see that here, accumulator is an empty array because, well, we started it. And the array is 0 and 1. Now I have a couple options. I can hit play, which resumes the entire thing, or I can hit step over. And let's see what happens with step over. It goes to the next line. And if I click again, it goes to the next line. And now I see that the accumulator is 0 and 1, and the array is now 2 and 3. So I know that in the next line, the accumulator, well, I changed this to an array by mistake, but this will be the accumulator, will be 0 and 1 dot concat 2 and 3. And I can keep stepping through this and see how the parameters change. And literally go through the entire function. Let's close that down. If I bring this back to the way it was, which is the accumulator, make this full screen. All right, so array is 0, 1, accumulator is an empty array. I'm going to step through. That changed. Accumulator is now 0, 1, array 2, 3. And I keep stepping through and I notice exactly what's happening in the code. And when it's done executing, it returns. And look at that. We have our console back. Isn't that cool? Debugger allows us to literally go into the function and see what happens step by step. As I return this to the way it was, I want you to take this with you and understand that although when you first see something like this, it's overwhelming, with enough time and using console and debugger, you're able to understand what a function does. And if it's doing something that you don't expect it to or is doing something wrong, you can use these techniques to fix it. It's a very useful skill that you're going to use a lot of. So good luck. Have fun out there. Bye-bye.